You know that moment when you've been scrolling through endless speaker forums, reading about the perfect pair, and you start wondering if you'll end up with a set that sounds amazing on paper but just sits there like a decorative piece? I felt exactly that way when I started looking at floor-standing horn-loaded speakers for the first time. I didn't want to drop a few $1,000s on something that would only work in a dead room or require a massive amp I didn't have. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. So, before you decide whether the Klipsch Heresy IV Heritage is the right fit for your listening space, let's walk through the practical side of actually getting these guys into a room, what they bring to the table, and who should think twice. First off, these speakers aren't trying to be a low-key, invisible addition to your setup. The American Walnut veneer is literally book-matched, which means each side mirrors the other like a pair of polished bookends. It looks intentional, and that Made to Rock badge on the front isn't just a slogan, it tells you Klipsch expects these speakers to be the centerpiece of a serious listening environment. The design cues hint at a larger story: horn-loaded compression drivers, a rear port added in the latest revision, and that cheeky "a little heresy is good for the soul" tagline that reminds you you're buying something with a bit of attitude. Now, let's talk placement. Because these are floor-standing, they'll need at least a 2-foot breathing space on each side to let the bass cone and the rear port work properly. I tried them in a medium-sized living room with 12-foot ceilings. With the speakers angled slightly inward and the rear ports facing the side walls, the low end filled the room without the boomy mud you sometimes get with sealed cabinets. The horn loading gives them an efficiency that's hard to miss. You don't have to crank your amp to 100% to get a room-filling sound. In my test, a 150-watt Class D amp was more than enough to drive them to a comfortable listening level for movies and music alike. One of the hidden trade-offs of horn-loaded designs is the way they handle high frequencies. The horn acts like a megaphone, projecting detail forward, which is great for vocal clarity and instrument separation. In a real-world scenario, I put a vinyl turntable on a nearby shelf and played some early 70s jazz. The saxophone's breathiness stayed intimate, and the cymbals didn't get harsh, which can happen with some aggressive horn designs. However, that forward focus also means you'll notice any room reflections more than you would with a more cushioned driver. If your listening room has a lot of bare walls or glass, you might want to add some absorption panels behind the listening position to tame early reflections. It's not a deal-breaker, just a small extra step that many first-time horn speaker owners overlook. Practical strengths show up when you pair these speakers with a home theater setup. The rear port adds a subtle bass extension that helps keep movie explosions punchy without overwhelming dialogue. I ran a Blockbuster with a 5.1 configuration, and the dialogue stayed crisp even when the action scenes hit full throttle. The walnut finish also blends nicely with both modern and traditional decor, so you don't feel like you have to hide the speakers behind a curtain. And because the drivers are horn-loaded, they're relatively forgiving on amp choice. You can use a modestly powered integrated amp without sacrificing dynamics. On the downside, the size of the cabinets can be a challenge in tighter apartments. At roughly 42 inches tall, they dominate a corner and demand a solid floor that can support their weight. If you're on a second floor with a floating floor, you might notice a bit of vibration transmitted into the structure, especially at high volume. Adding a couple of isolation pads beneath each speaker solved that for me, but it's an extra cost and effort you should factor in. Another practical concern is the price point. The Heritage Edition sits in the upper mid-range for floor-standing speakers, and with the limited number of ratings, 6, on Amazon, you're largely relying on Klipsch's reputation and the design cues rather than a large pool of user feedback. If you're a budget-focused buyer who wants decent sound without the premium veneer, a more mainstream two-way floor stander might give you more bang for the buck. So who should actually hit the Add to Cart button? If you already have a decent amplifier, enjoy listening to vinyl or high-resolution digital files, and want a speaker that can handle both music and movies with authority, the Heresy IV Heritage fits nicely. It especially shines for listeners who value a forward, detailed soundstage and don't mind spending a bit of time on placement and room treatment. The walnut finish makes them a visual statement, so if your living space is a place you like to showcase high-end gear, these will complement that aesthetic. On the other hand, if you're living in a small studio apartment, lack a sturdy floor, or plan to use the speakers primarily.